Okay, in the wake of Gamescom, it seemed to be the case that news emerged that Avowed for Xbox is going to be running at 30 frames per second. And yeah, as usual, some people were quite upset about this. In fact, we got this question from supporter Ryan Peters. With the news that Avowed is targeting 30 FPS on console, a lot of gamers on social media seem unreasonably irate. Lots of talk about how the game, quote unquote, must be unoptimized or the devs must be quote unquote incompetent. being being a fan of nice smooth frame rates, this sounds like they have their priorities in check to me. In addition, the game does seem to be a UE5 title with the latest and greatest tech, so it makes sense to me why they chose 30. How do you feel about games like Avowed targeting 30 FPS? And is any of the quote unquote gamer outrage justified? Oliver.
Ugh, I don't know.
Oof, I'm glad you went to Oliver
I
first.
don't know. I don't know. I think people have different expectations about games, and I think that's fair. Last generation, things were 30 FPS predominantly. This generation, things are 60 FPS predominantly. Is it justified? I mean, I think it depends on the person, but I mean, honestly, if they're doing a really advanced UE5 game, which it seems like they're doing here, like to me, I looked at some footage recently for this, and looks like they're using VSMs. There's very fine shadow detail, great fall off at range. I think they're using software lumen GI and reflections. If I had to guess, it looks very handsome. The lighting quality looks very good. I think that they do justify it to some degree by embracing those headline features. And we see on consoles exactly what games look like often when you take those features and try to put them to 16.6 milliseconds. It often doesn't work very well. Yeah, but I mean, it also depends on what reason they have for this, right? One reason could be that they've built the game for 30 FPS and they just don't have like the CPU time to bring it to 60. So it could have big issues with maybe traversal stutters or other technical hurdles that present much less favorably at 60 FPS and 30 FPS. The other reason could just be that they're trying to make a game that is a 30 FPS game and they like the way that the art looks at that resolution. They like the way the effects look at that resolution, at the resolutions they're able to hit. And kind of like a game like Hellblade 2, maybe they could get to 60 on the consoles, on a console class piece of kit like Rich took at with the Hellblade 2 coverage. But they just choose not to because they want to embrace that 30 FPS update. They think the game looks best and runs best at that update. And I think that's totally fair as well. So I don't know. I think it's a matter of personal perspective on whether you think this is acceptable or not. I mean, personally, I do like games at 60, but I think if a game is at 30, they do build the game around it being at 30, and the graphics look great at 30, and the input lag is fine. I don't think there's any particular issue with that. I think that's perfectly fine.
Well, we do have some comments from the developers. Speaking on the Iron Lords podcast, got this off Video Games Chronicle, by the way. Art director Matt Hansen called 30 FPS the quote-unquote bare minimum the team is aiming for. It's a first-person single-player game. You don't necessarily need that 60 frames, and that allows us to get a lot juicier with VFX and lighting and all this other stuff. It's a trade-off we opted to make relatively early, and we're happy with that. The game's running pretty smooth for how visually dense it is, and that was always our goal. John, seems like, well, I'm not sure about this comment about a first-person single-player game. You don't necessarily need that 60 frames per second. I don't know about that, but, if they're basically budgeting the whole visual makeup of the game around a 30 FPS update on consoles, then, fine.
I mean, yeah, I'd say necessarily is the key word there, where you don't necessarily need it. It can be okay at times. We've seen it before. I was perfectly okay with Starfield at launch 30. I was okay with Hellblade 2. when done well, I think it's acceptable enough. So it does seem like the thoughts around this all tend to come out on two extremes, where it's either completely bad or it's completely fine. And I think the truth is more in the middle, and it can vary from game to game. And most people can adapt to lower frame rates if they need to. But I think most would also agree that a higher frame rate when offered is a better solution. But it doesn't necessarily ruin the game. Right. And I think given, think about where we've come from as well for this type of first-person style RPG. You go back just one generation ago, stuff like Fallout 4 coming out, running like absolute garbage on those original consoles, and people still love the game. obviously standards have changed, and those standards have brought us to now a minimum where I think 30 FPS stable is kind of the minimum, and okay. If they're dipping below that, then that's a serious problem. But if they can actually hit a stable 30, I think it'll be okay enough.
It's an interesting point about the development of performance across the years. The PlayStation 3 generation of the Xbox 360 generation, notoriously bad performance, where 30 FPS was often not achieved in AAA games.
No.
And I think, despite the CPU limitations of the next generation, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, performance generally improved across the board, I'd say. And now we're into this generation, and I'd say that performance has generally improved again across the board. Yep. And I think, 30 FPS being the bare minimum, as long as it's a consistent 30 FPS, I'd kind of go along with that. And if we've got the team here saying, we actually budgeted our graphics to a 30 FPS update, then that's the way it is. If it was going to be 60 FPS, you'd have a very different looking game. And that is the choice the developer chose to make. And you have to kind of respect it. And if you're not happy about 30 frames per second, there are options, right?
There are.
You can play it on PC.
The thing is, though, is I guess, so obviously hitting 60 does typically demand that you're targeting that from the beginning, because a lot of our pipeline optimizations, things need to be taken into consideration. But as we've seen with something like Starfield, where months later they were able to actually achieve a performance mode on the consoles, it shows that there's headroom there. Yeah. But I would say that that's a different situation given what that engine is. And it's still not perfect there. We know that Unreal Engine 5 is extremely heavy on these machines, and that getting to 60 FPS requires, if you haven't budgeted for that from the beginning, then the sacrifices required are going to be huge.
Yeah.
Especially just in terms of image quality. And I mean, it would likely suffer a lot, and maybe they don't want to go there. Look at Wukong. Like, the only performance mode in there is frame generated. And it's not really, that's not a great use case for frame generation, right?
No, not at all. I mean, going back to Ryan's question here, is any of the quote unquote gamer outrage justified? The vast majority of gamer outrage I'm seeing is totally unjustified, to be honest. If you don't want to play Avowed at 30 FPS, just don't buy it. I mean, the amount of abuse developers are getting is there's no justification for that ever. But absolutely there can be a reaction, but the concept of turning it into an outrage, I'm not on board with that at all.
Is an outrage.
It is an outrage.